afternoon. Thank you so much for joining today's program. My name is Kelly Anderson, and I'm a Senior Director of Health and Drug Policy at the Chamber's Global Innovation Policy Center. We are so honored to be joined today by Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland and an esteemed group of panelists to discuss the innovation ecosystem in Washington. Most people, I think, are probably unaware that the research to develop the next generation of breakthrough treatments and cures is taking place right now in their local communities. So our conversation today will discuss that innovative research that is taking place in the Congresswoman's district and across Washington, and the public policy framework that's needed to sustain that investment and innovation. Today's program is being co-hosted by the Association of Washington Business and the Tacoma-Pierce County Chamber of Commerce. So I'd like to welcome Chris Johnson, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Washington Business, to offer opening remarks.
Thank you, Kelly. Medical innovation happens in communities all across America, and including in Washington's 10th Congressional District. Our businesses and universities drove the development of today's life-saving COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics, and are continuing to work around the clock to discover and deliver the needed breakthrough treatments and cures of tomorrow. These accomplishments don't happen by accident. America's innovation ecosystem empowers new medical breakthroughs by encouraging collaboration and supporting access to a vast network of small businesses. In Washington, the life science industry directly employs nearly 36,000 people and supports an additional 90,000 jobs in sectors as diverse as construction to transportation to manufacturing. And in the construction field alone, 17 pharmaceutical and biotech projects valued at $345 million are occurring in our state right now. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated that working together, we can achieve more. Our guest today, Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, understands well the role that government officials and the business community play in supporting innovation in the local economy. As the mayor of Tacoma, the Congresswoman was responsible for attracting over $1 billion in investment and creating over 40,000 new jobs in the Tacoma region. Prior to serving as a member of Congress, the Congresswoman was the president and CEO of the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce, where she worked to advance a pro-business agenda for companies large and small. The innovative community is counting on great leaders like the Congresswoman to champion policies that support the local business community and promote continued investment and innovation. We are grateful for the Congresswoman's leadership in driving a policy agenda in Washington that will support innovators and businesses here in the real Washington. Congresswoman, we are honored that you can join us here today. And now here to moderate the conversation, Frank Cohen with the U.S. Chamber.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction. And we're also very thrilled to be joined by the Congresswoman. Congresswoman Strickland, I'd be remiss if before I started, we did not thank you for all your service to your community and our nation. You know, you served on the front lines as a mayor, as we just heard. You certainly had the opportunity now to be at the center of so many important issues that are affecting our nation with all the things that are going on in Washington. And we just want to thank you for your leadership and your commitment to really making sure that the people of your district and our nation are well served during these very challenging times. So thank you for making time to be with us. I'd like to first ask if perhaps you could share some of your perspectives before we get to our Q&A. You've obviously had that experience of being on the front lines, not only as a mayor, but a president of a local chamber of commerce. You understand the private sector, you understand government, and you understand the important symbiotic relationship that exists in public and private partnerships, which is how we're getting through this pandemic. So we'd really welcome your comments to better understand what's top of mind for you and what your constituents are most concerned about during these very, very interesting times. Congresswoman?
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I want to thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Global Innovation Policy Center, the Association of Washington Business, the Tacoma-Pierce County Chamber, and all the partners here. So, I really appreciate your question because, what is top of mind right now for most people, not just in the district, but across the state and across the nation. And I would say for us here in Washington state and even in our local communities, people are still worried about the effect of the pandemic, right? We are still not able to feel 100% confident about our activities as relates to going out and having dinner, going to a sporting event, even traveling on an airplane. And so this really underscores the significance of the work that all of these public and private sector partners have done in creating a vaccine. And then even some of the research is happening now with Efficacy to try and treat people who have COVID. And there's one thing that this all has in common. This is about public sector and private sector working together. That's how we came up with the vaccine. It's how we're going to look at some treatments. And it's just important that we are supporting this very important ecosystem. Whether we call it life sciences or biotech, it is a bunch of different people in different sectors doing everything from research to clinical trials. They're small businesses, they're large businesses, but we all have a singular goal here. And this is about improving the public health of our communities that we love and treasure so much. I would also say top of mind for folks right now is just the idea of government being able to do big things like we did in the past. You know, as you watch the news, you know, there is some back and forth happening about some of these infrastructure packages, but I do want to say one thing. We are going to pass both. Joseph Robinette Biden, who has been waiting a long time to become president, is going to ensure that we're able to come together and to get these things passed. And we know that this is going to result in so many things for our communities, but most importantly, they're going to be jobs that pay well. It's an opportunity for financial security, the ability to retire with dignity, and making sure that we are respecting and honoring all work. So what's top of mind right now? The pandemic, economic opportunity, and just doing what we can to ensure that we have a planet that we can enjoy 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for those insightful comments. You know, it's really fascinating to think that clinical research is really happening all across the country to get us through this pandemic. And it's happening right in your very own community, as you know. And some of the work in your community has been critical to delivering best-in-class treatments for COVID-19 patients. Well, as I said, in your very own congressional district. So the technology unleashed in response to the global pandemic is now being studied to address an array of health challenges right there in Washington 10. Now, there are 2 studies we understand across 11 different locations analyzing mRNA technology in the treatment of breast cancer. Could you share with us why you believe it's important to run these cutting-edge clinical trials in your district and the benefits these trials bring to your community?
Yeah, you know, it's pretty exciting to know that there's a lot happening right in the 10th Congressional District of Washington State. And when we have traditionally think about life sciences or biotech, I think for a lot of people, they think automatically Lake Union or South Lake Union in Seattle, but it's in the entire district. You know, and here in the 10th District, we're doing things at Madigan Army Medical Center, JBLM, Providence St. Pete, Multicare, CHI Franciscan. A lot of these organizations are deeply involved in doing these trials in the district. And, you know, we wouldn't be where we are right now without the FDA approved vaccine that is safe and effective. And people will hear me talk about this ad nauseum. You got to get vaccinated. It has been tested thoroughly for a very long time. There is efficacy here. And the best way to avoid being in the hospital on a ventilator from COVID is to get vaccinated. And so I think for me, you know, just the excitement of having these things happen here in our district, you know, I would tell you, Frank, that I don't think a lot of people even have any idea that these things are happening right here in the 10th. And so as we try to demystify, as we tell the story of how the 10th Congressional District of Washington State is an integral partner in combating COVID and looking at chronic disease and doing what we can to find cures and to help people manage them, we are a big part of this conversation. And so I'm proud to represent the 10th District. And I hope that we're able to do a couple things to amplify the fact that Washington State is a leader in life sciences and biotech, and also to make sure that we're thinking about geographic equity as we think about where we're doing clinical trials, and also the opportunity to put jobs here in our district that are related to biotech that pay really well.
Well, clearly innovation is thriving in your district. And here at the Global Innovation Policy Center, we could not be more thrilled to hear these really excellent examples of what's happening across the country, but particularly in Washington 10. And later in the program, we're going to hear from a few of the leaders from the military and biotech communities who've really spearheaded this groundbreaking work in Washington 10. You know, across the innovative community, IP, or intellectual property, is key to fostering the research and development of new tests, therapeutics, and vaccines. Can you tell us a little bit about the way that you think IP policy has helped sustain the investment in research and development in your district?
Yeah, when we think about intellectual property, this is really about protecting the innovation that's happening to make sure that we're able to do it. And that, in many ways, this is about global competition. And so as I think about intellectual property, we need policy that's going to help us continue supporting the very companies that are doing the work, the ones that are making the investments, the ones that are putting in the effort to do groundbreaking research, and really to protect against competition that's going to potentially undermine it. And, in the world of life sciences and biotech, we all want to believe that everyone's doing everything for the greater good, but, with intellectual property, we need protections to make sure that our companies here in the US are going to be able to do the work and to lead in innovation. I would also say too that, as we think about IP or intellectual property, we need to make sure that the policies are updated for the 21st century. Innovation happens at lightning speed. And this is why it's important for those of us who are public servants and policymakers to have strong relationships with the private sector so that we know exactly what is happening and that we are listening to find out what we can do to protect and promote innovation. And then I'd say the other thing too, in cases where drug patents have expired, we want to make sure that these drugs are being made available in generic form or some biosimilar competition so that patients, again, this is all about helping patients have options, and importantly, have options that are affordable. So there's a lot that goes on with this entire supply chain and ecosystem. We need to make sure that we are communicating and having open lines of communication with both the public and private sector, because we all want the same thing.
Well, a couple of things you mentioned, our competitiveness, how innovation occurs in an ecosystem, really bring to mind the fact that innovation occurs across the entire spectrum of industry. And you understand this better than so many others. Many people think of the US Chamber of Commerce as just representing big business. And in fact, so many of our companies are small businesses. In fact, the majority are. And you, during your career as president of the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce, as mayor of Tacoma, and now in Congress, you have not only a unique perspective, but you've championed the role small businesses and entrepreneurs play in driving economic growth. So as our audience will hear during the panel discussion, small businesses are vital to a thriving innovation ecosystem, both in Washington State and across the country. So what role do you see small businesses playing in fostering innovation in your district?
Now, that's a great question. And I say this because when we think about, again, life sciences and biotech, people often think about what I call the well-known household brand names. And in many cases, there are a lot of small organizations that are doing cutting-edge research. In Tacoma alone, for example, there's the RAIN Incubator, which works with JBLM and Multicare. And it's a scrappy shop, but they're doing some great things related to, how we look at COVID. And so, again, coming back to the ecosystem, small businesses will always play a critical role when it comes to leading innovation in the sustainable economy. When I was at the Seattle Metro Chamber of Commerce, here's a data point that a lot of people don't know. 80% of the members were small businesses with 10 or fewer employees. And this is incredibly important because I remind folks that some of these large global entities we know started as small local businesses. And so they work together. Those of you who are on this call understand also that, some of our largest employers actually do a lot of purchasing with small businesses. And so the ecosystem and the relationship is so incredibly important. And, we know in 2020 in Washington State, for example, there were about 600,000 small businesses supporting 1.4 million workers. And that covers about a third of the state's workforce and 99.5% of all businesses in the state. So when we talk about life sciences, when we talk about biotech, when we talk about the ecosystem, small businesses are often the most innovative and the biggest beneficiaries of making sure that we have good policies, we're protecting intellectual property, and we're doing what we can, again, to foster these public-private partnerships.
Those are some very, very compelling and important statistics you cited. And I think no one can really overstate the role small business plays throughout the country. And when we talk about the importance of biopharmaceutical innovation, many people assume we're just talking about the role of a researcher in a lab, those folks in the white coats, right? And while the biopharmaceutical industry directly supports over 35,000 jobs in Washington, you talked about the number of jobs that are being created just a moment ago, it also underpins the local economy in a wide variety of other ways. Now, for example, pharmaceutical construction projects supported $13 million in union wages over a 5-year period. And you've stated that one of your top priorities in Congress is to rebuild the economy after the economic recession. And as someone who's brought a lot of investment back home as a mayor, and certainly during your work in Congress to help sustain people through COVID, you know an awful lot about this. Can you tell us about the role the innovative community will play in reinvigorating the local economy back in your district?
Oh, absolutely. You know, when I think about the Pacific Northwest, we take pride in just coming out first in inventing great things. And sometimes we don't necessarily do something that's new. We just have the courage to do something that needs to happen. And so as I think about the innovative economy, it is in the entire, I would tell, up and down the I-5 corridor, and everyone has a role to play. So as we think about how we're going to rebuild the economy, we know that nations that are competitive, because I tell folks that, yes, in some cases, we're competing with different regions in the country, but our competition is across oceans. And we want to make sure that we continue to lead and that we're investing in people. And again, that we have rules in place that allow innovation to take place. When you think about the biotech and life sciences infrastructure, these are companies and organizations that need what? They need people at every level to open the doors, to keep the place moving. And so in many cases, there are functions in accounting, there are functions in custodial, there are functions in small business procurement, there are functions in communication, there are functions in marketing, just like any other organization. Yes, we love the scientists because they do amazing things, but it requires an entire support system of running an organization to keep these going. And so as we're talking about life sciences and biotech jobs, we're talking about organizations that need people in every single sector. And what's cool about this too is that you don't have to have a PhD in bioscience to work in biotech. You can have every level of education and know that you're contributing to the greater good, to find cures, to be innovative, and to be part of this incredible, important sector in Washington State.
Well, it's interesting, the word ecosystem gets thrown around a lot, but it really does take an entire ecosystem to support these industries and innovation. At the beginning of the conversation, we discussed the importance of innovative clinical trials taking place in your district and also across the state of Washington and the nation. And during your time in Congress, and particularly as a member of the Armed Services Committee, you've been a vocal advocate for service members and military families, and we thank you for that. Supporting a continued investment in innovation is going to be critical to strengthening the medical care and treatments available to active duty military and veterans. In fact, there's a small biotech company near your district conducting cutting-edge research into innovative treatments for traumatic brain injury, a condition which many military families know all too well, very sadly. Can you tell us why you believe it's critical that we continue to invest in these kinds of innovative treatments and the healthcare system more broadly to support active duty service members, their families, and our veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you on this call who don't know my family's history, we live in Tacoma, Washington because my father was in the Army. And so I am a longtime patient, either as a young woman or even through my parents at Madigan Army Medical Center. And I have seen the evolution of Madigan Army Medical Center over time. It is now a well-respected teaching hospital. They have a population in many ways is the cross-section of America. If you think about who is in the military, it is one of the most diverse workforces you will find. 40% are people of color, 20% are African American, and people come from all walks of life. And so you have a population here that can be very instrumental in helping us advance innovation in biotech. The other thing, of course, that's important too, is that, when people serve, they sometimes, have some diseases, even though it's a young population. When you look at the age of people who are veterans, people get old. And so they are served at Madigan as well. And so the opportunity to have, again, one of the largest cross sections of people representing all different folks is really right here in our backyard. And I was proud that, during the appropriations process, members of Congress, including our own Derek Kilmer, who sits on that committee, they are absolutely invested in investing in medical care and in making priorities for different research and programs. And we're pushing for the National Institutes of Health to invest more. We're pushing for the Centers for Disease Control because these are all public health entities. But again, it comes together and is the best example of how the public sector and the private sector all work together. And I want to speak, specifically about some of the injuries that some of our warriors come back home with, whether it's brain injury or even some of the physical injuries they have. And this presents an opportunity for us to do some research, to think about how we treat people and to make sure that, they are able to function as much as they can. So, JBLM and the 10th Congressional District and all the people who serve and wear that uniform, they're an integral part of our ability to bring cutting edge innovation and to do what we can to find more cures for chronic disease and to, again, do what we can to protect people's health.
Well, Congresswoman, it is really an honor to be with you today, to have a chance to hear your thoughts and your insights, and also just another opportunity to thank you for your leadership, your continued leadership, and the contributions you've made over the years. We look forward to continuing to work with you. There are so many important issues facing our nation. You're at the forefront of the efforts to deal with those issues. And we just want to, again, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today, for sharing your thoughts and insights. And I would be remiss if I did not give you the opportunity to have the final word for any other thoughts or comments you'd like to share before we turn to our panel. Thank you again, Congressman.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who are on this call and for the work that you do. I remember during my time at the Seattle Metro Chamber, we would have conversations about life sciences and biotech. And what are we doing to elevate its presence and to demonstrate that this region, the Pacific Northwest, the South Puget Sound, we're doing fantastic work. And so anything I can do to elevate that voice and to let people know about what we're doing here, and also to ensure folks that this is about good health outcomes. We want to protect people's health and well-being, and we are doing it right here in the 10th District, right here in Washington State. So I am proud to use my platform to amplify that message and let me know what I can do to support more public and private partnerships and making those investments in key research. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Thank you, Congresswoman Strickland, and we look forward to that continued partnership. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly Anderson, for our panel discussion, which we have some amazing speakers. Kelly?
Thanks so much, Frank. And Congresswoman, let me echo Frank's thanks for all of your work to further innovation across Washington. So to continue the discussion today, I'm honored to be joined by a group of esteemed panelists. We have Leslie Alexandre, who is the president and CEO of Life Sciences Washington. And after we just heard so much about all of the good work that's happening at Madigan from the Congresswoman, we have 3 representatives from Madigan Army Medical Center, including Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Colombo, the Chief of Virtual Health and Telecritical Care at the Madigan Army Medical Center. We have Dr. Rhonda Colombo, an infectious disease physician at the Madigan Army Medical Center. And then we're also joined by Major Benjamin Cook, the medical director and assistant professor of pathology at the F. Edward Herbert School of Medicine, also at the Madigan Army Medical Center. So we have so much to cover today, so let's jump right in. Leslie, I'll start with you. As we just heard from the Congresswoman, Washington has really been a leader in the life sciences innovation for a long time. And I think we certainly saw this leadership in action during the global pandemic with the Kaiser Permanente Washington Health Research Institute in Seattle administering the very first dose of the Moderna vaccine back when it was in phase 1 clinical trials. And we know that this innovative research wasn't conducted there by accident, but rather because of the state has been a longstanding leader in biopharmaceutical innovation. So I'd love for you to start our conversation today by telling us a bit more about the framework for innovation in Washington that has led to this innovative research being conducted there throughout the pandemic.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm absolutely delighted. And before I answer the question, I'd like to thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, AWB, and the Tacoma-Pierce County Chamber, all of you for helping to organize the event. And I especially want to thank Congresswoman Strickland for being a supporter of medical innovation and our local companies. And specifically, I want to thank her for her work on innovation centers, R&D expensing, and of course, NIH and DoD funding for medical research. Now, back to your question. In Washington, I'm not sure that we have a framework per se, but what we have is an incredible collection of private and public life science organizations, biotech companies, nonprofits, research institutes, and medical device companies that we have built over the decades. Our top research institutes are among the most competitive in the country for federal research funding. We have benefited from long-term, stable philanthropic support for organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Allen Institute, Fred Hutch, just to name a few. And while we're not Silicon Valley, our companies have enjoyed pretty good access to capital and venture funding. Having such a strong life science ecosystem and one of the leading public health systems in the nation allowed us to respond to COVID in ways that other regions simply couldn't, while also having a global impact on fighting the pandemic. Let me walk you through a few quick examples. Remember when we first learned that we had community spread of COVID? We found it here because the Gates Foundation had supported the Seattle flu study, and they used samples collected for that flu study to detect the first case of COVID resulting from community spread. Then when there wasn't any COVID testing available, remember those days? UW Virology developed their own test. So when other states were waiting a week or more to ship the tests across the country, UW was turning them around in 24 to 48 hours. Then on March 16th, less than 2 months after the first case was identified, as you just noted, the Kaiser Health Research Institute in Seattle launched the first clinical trial for a COVID vaccine in the world. Why Seattle? Because we have some of the best infectious disease and clinical trial experts in the world right here in our state. As the scale of the pandemic became clear, Washington companies jumped into action to provide the best possible treatment of hospitalized patients and to develop new treatments and preventive measures. Remember when there was a shortage of ventilators? In just a few weeks, in the chaos of a global pandemic, a very small company in Bothell, Ventec Life Systems, partnered with General Motors to go from making a couple of hundred ventilators per month to delivering roughly 30,000 ventilators. It's due to that kind of effort that you don't hear about ventilator shortages anymore. At the same time, another Bothell company, Sonosite, was shipping handheld ultrasounds globally to help diagnose COVID faster and more efficiently. Instead of moving patients to the ultrasound, which are huge machines typically, and then spending hours cleaning that machine for use by the next patient, the ultrasound is brought directly to the patient's bedside. Fred Hutch was responsible for managing all of the phase 3 clinical trials nationally for the COVID vaccines. The Hutch also conducted clinical trials for Merck's new COVID antiviral that we have just heard cuts the risk of hospitalization from COVID by 50% and is now going through an accelerated FDA approval process, a very powerful tool in the arsenal against COVID. Companies like HDT Bio and Adaptive Biotechnologies are continuing to develop COVID vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostic tests, while companies like AGC Biologics and Jubilant Hollister-Steer are manufacturing vaccines and vaccine components across the state. And our outstanding hospitals, including Madigan Army, are conducting clinical trials and new therapeutics to give doctors more options in treating COVID patients. It's truly incredible how much COVID-related research and product development is going on right here in Washington. But it's not an accident, and it's really no surprise to people in the industry. That's because Washington has spent decades, yes, decades, developing the infrastructure and expertise that made it possible for our companies and research institutes to be able to respond so quickly and so collaboratively to this pandemic. We can all be very proud that Washington life science institutions and companies are helping lead us out of the current pandemic and to prepare for the next one.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to reflect on how far we've come. I was just saying to friends over the weekend that I remember at the beginning of COVID when I used to go for walks and I would cross the street if I saw somebody else coming because there was so much unknown, about what was happening in terms of community transmission. So very interesting to think back on how far we've come in the last 18 months. So Lieutenant Colonel Colombo and Major Cook, let me bring you guys into the conversation. So as we heard from the Congresswoman, Madigan is one of the Department of Defense's largest medical training facilities, and has really been a leader in advancing biomedical research in Washington. So at the start of the global pandemic, as Leslie just mentioned, Madigan ran a series of trials to help identify effective therapeutics for COVID-19. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you both about the adaptive COVID-19 treatment trial and the COVID-19 convalescent plasma trial that you both respectively worked on. So maybe Lieutenant Colonel Colombo, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, the adaptive COVID treatment trial was a multi-site randomized controlled trial run out of the National Institutes of Health. Madigan was one of the sites and one of initially 4 or 5 DoD sites, and eventually we had up to 6. It was a little bit of serendipity. The chief PI for the DoD was a combined infectious disease critical care physician. So when Mrs. Dr. Colombo's boss, who was helping liaise with the NIH, found there was an intensivist married to an infectious disease doctor here at Madigan, we were tapped to help bring the ACT trial here. So as you said, it's the adaptive COVID treatment trial. And the entire point was to look at therapeutics, and as we gained information from the first iteration of the trial, to look at questions generated and issues found in MAD in order to investigate the next group of agents. So we started out with the antiviral remdesivir versus placebo in a randomized controlled trial. And we're one of the many sites that enrolled patients early on in the pandemic. I believe that was started up really in March at Madigan, and in February overall for the trial. And we found that remdesivir had a positive result in shortening the length of hospitalization, a positive impact on mortality, although it didn't reach statistical significance. The study wasn't powered to do that, but it did show a benefit. But it was very obvious in the conclusions that we were very restrained in the conclusions to say that this was definitely not the final answer for treating COVID-19, which led us to Act 2, 3, and 4 before we finished up the ACT trial. So in the second trial, we compared remdesivir and baricitinib in combination to remdesivir and a placebo, and that has also become a part of the armamentarium as an anti-inflammatory against COVID-19. In the third iteration of the trial, we looked at remdesivir and interferon in combination, and found that a negative trial that didn't show a difference is just as important as a positive one, because as we've known from the pandemic, therapeutics has been a bit of a minefield in people rushing to use things that are supposed to work or may work, or they figure have to work, and without doing the science and the research to determine whether they actually do work or whether they may cause harm to patients. So, ethically, I think it's very important that placebo trials happen to establish the efficacy of these medications, and then they're further investigated in real-world combinations of how we use them. And that's what we did with Act 4, was that the recovery trial in the United Kingdom had looked at dexamethasone steroid treatment for an anti-inflammatory around June. That was published of 2020. And that started to become a combination therapy with remdesivir, although no one had ever done a trial of those two in combination. Since we'd already had Act 2 showing that remdesivir baricitinib was better than remdesivir alone, we did Act 4 as a comparison of remdesivir with baricitinib versus remdesivir and dexamethasone. A full analysis of that trial is still undergoing, but the top line result is that those were two equivalent treatments of having an antiviral and an anti-inflammatory together, which is excellent. It really extends the access for medications to having multiple choices that are equivalent. In a resource limited environment, as we've learned in the pandemic, you may not always have everything you wish to. So having options is important. So those are the 4 that we did over the year. And I'll happily lateral to Major Cook. This has been going on so long. When I first met him for the trials, he was Captain Cook. So it has been a minute for this pandemic.
Thank you, sir. It's interesting that we're talking about the convalescent plasma program as far as innovations in science. So the convalescent plasma actually has a very long history, beginning in the late 19th century and getting further refined in the 20th century as a treatment and prevention for bacterial and viral infections. It was originally billed as serum therapy, with Dr. Bering exposing horses to diphtheria toxin to successfully treat humans, which yielded him the Nobel Prize in 1901. So this is a long history on this. The passive immunity provided was due to donor antibodies. Say again, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Cook, but I bet there are a lot of people in the audience who do not know what convalescent plasma is. So could you just define that term for people? Your data, it's fabulous, but I'm a little worried that people may not understand.
Absolutely. So convalescent plasma is donor-derived plasma. So when you donate blood products, you donate red blood cells, there are white blood cells in there, and we also have the plasma component, which is the liquid component of the blood. And plasma contains antibodies, immunoglobulins, clotting proteins as well. And so this component can be taken off the blood product and administered to patients as a passive immunity. Basically, it's kind of like giving them a dose of antiviral medication, or monoclonal antibodies is something you might hear about a lot. This is basically a donor that provides those monoclonal antibodies to the patient.
Thank you. Thanks. I think that probably helped you.
No worries. At Madigan, it's interesting because at Madigan, we were primed to start a convalescent plasma program because we do have a blood donor center on site that was able, with the support and assistance of the infectious disease team and the Dr. Colombos, to rapidly stand up a convalescent donor program. And this actually created a stockpile of plasma that has been used not only locally, but also nationwide. Using donor plasma has challenges as well. As the plasma is derived from the donor, each dose varies in its efficacy and its antibodies. So making a randomized control study with this is difficult. So when Dr. Colombo talks about the randomized control studies that he does, convalescent plasma kind of is limited in that factor. So the dosing has been a challenge. There were several studies put out, and we were a part of the study that used it as a last resort medication. So as patients exhausted all their treatment options, this was the last option for them. Other studies have used convalescent plasma early in the disease, and actually those studies have shown better outcomes than ours has. So there are challenges. Fortunately, as the other trials progress and as vaccines and monoclonal antibody therapies evolve, the utility for convalescent plasma shrinks. So actually our study has been closed since then, as these other treatment modalities have become more effective. But convalescent plasma still does hold a place in the modern era of treating infectious diseases.
It's such an interesting story. I think, a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate the fact that a lot of these technologies that we've used in response to COVID have been around for decades, if not centuries, like convalescent plasma. So appreciate you shedding a little more light on that. So let's bring Dr. Colombo into the conversation here. This is actually our 10th or 11th Discover and Deliver event, and this is the first time we've had a husband and wife couple on the panel. So we're excited for that. So Dr. Colombo, COVID-19 has obviously been our whole world for the last 18 months. But it's equally important that clinical research for all diseases has continued. So you're an infectious disease specialist. I imagine you've been quite busy over the last 18 months. But I also know that your work to tackle any other number of infectious diseases was ongoing during the global pandemic. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of that great work that you've led at Madigan?
Sure, thank you for the opportunity to do so. Obviously, as you alluded to, COVID-19 has been at the forefront of much of the work that I've done. Just as a little bit of background, I'm employed by the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for the Advancement of Military Medicine, and I work in support of the Uniformed Services Infectious Disease Clinical Research Program. And so over the last 18, 20 months or so, the Infectious Disease Clinical Research Program, which we call IDCRP, has helped facilitate within the DoD the ACT trials that Lieutenant Colonel Colombo spoke on, and then also has been involved in several other COVID-related research, including a longitudinal cohort study that we call EPIC, and it is really allowing us to gather information that can help in the development of diagnostic strategies, learning about potential reinfections or vaccine breakthroughs, looking at different treatment modalities in a more pragmatic, just observational manner, and so forth. And then we've also, the IDCRP has also been augmenting the Operation Warp Speed endeavors, and specifically at Madigan with a monoclonal antibody post-exposure prophylaxis study called Storm Chaser. So that's sort of the COVID work that's been ongoing. As far as non-COVID work, there has been some interruptions in some of our typical studies, but many of the research portfolio projects have been ongoing. Probably one of the most notable, especially at this time of year, is our pragmatic assessment of influenza vaccine effectiveness in the DoD, so the PAVED study. And what it is a comparative vaccine effectiveness study looking at 3 FDA-approved, licensed, commercially available influenza vaccines. All are quadrivalent inactivated influenza vaccines that you could receive if you went to any local commercial pharmacy for your vaccine, but they've never been compared head-to-head before. And so there are 3 different formulations. One is egg-based, one is cell culture-based, and one is recombinant. So that's just looking at how they're developed into a vaccine, the process. And it's thought that the development process may actually impact how what's called immunogenic the vaccine is slightly, and so how well the vaccine might work to protect you against influenza. But at the moment, current guidelines recommend you receive whichever of the age-appropriate vaccine is available when you go to receive it, and doesn't favor one over the other because they haven't been compared directly to know if one's better than the other. So we've actually been looking at this. This is our 4th year of the PAVED study. Originally, we were planning on finishing last year, and actually met our original target enrollment goal. It's a multi-site DoD-wide study. So we're one of 10 sites now. It started out in about 5 sites, and now it's 10. But with all of the various behavioral and social distancing pieces that went into place last year for COVID, fortunately for society, the influenza rates were very low last year, which is great, but it makes it very difficult to compare vaccine efficacy for influenza if there's no influenza, because you don't know which one's working better. They may all be. So we had to extend our trial for another year. We'll be enrolling this year at Madigan and at the other 9 sites, and with the goal of finishing and being able to do that comparison at the end of this year, which not only has implications for the DoD and policy making as to what vaccine we should purchase and what should be administered, but to potentially also to greater society as a whole.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking as you were speaking there is, I think one of the things that's so funny about this age of COVID is everybody, has a strong opinion about, the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the J&J, and there's all these, armchair scientists comparing the efficacy of the different vaccines and deciding which one they get based on that. And it occurred to me when you were talking, I've never thought to compare the efficacy of different flu vaccines, right? I just show up at CVS and I take whatever they give me. So it's interesting to learn about your work.
They've all certainly been in place, and they're safe, and we certainly recommend getting your flu vaccine, but we just want to make sure that we can optimize what our military population is receiving is the most effective. And if it's not any different, then that's fine to keep on with receiving whatever's there and whatever's available.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Can I jump in? Dr. Colombo, first of all, I loved hearing about that study because before I was here, I was in North Carolina. And one of the things we did a couple decades ago was recruited in the first company at the time, Novartis. It has since sold its cell culture-based flu vaccine facility, but we thought that was just the ultimate, right? It's getting away from egg-based flu vaccine development and last minute sort of guessing, right? What are the strains of flu you're going to produce? I'm curious, have we not already proven that we can have a more effective flu vaccine using cell culture? It's great to have the RNA addition to that, but I'm wondering, aren't we able to better do this sort of last minute to get the strains right for the vaccine for the coming year with existing technology?
So there's certainly a lot of ongoing work and theory about how to even further optimize the flu vaccine, including with potential with the novel breakthroughs in mRNA development and so forth. And actually part of the PAVE study is an immunogenicity sub-study where we collect blood before and then approximately 3 weeks after the vaccine receipt from a select number of participants who volunteer for this additional sub-study. And it is to allow us to look specifically at the immune response to vaccine and how genetic component may play a role. And some with the sera from that study may help further inform the development of a universal flu vaccine. That's the ultimate panacea, right? Is a universal vaccine that we can give and then it will protect you against whichever strain of influenza comes out instead of, as you said, the guessing match of determining what's the most likely flu strain that's going to emerge this year, and do we have a good match between our vaccine that we do and what's circulating or not. If we could develop a more universal vaccine that protected against multiple strains, it would be wonderful for all of us and have a significant impact on health. That's not there yet. There's a lot of work that's going on with that. And so really the PAVE study is just, as it says, a more pragmatic one, looking at, based on what we have now, which is most effective, or is there a difference that we can detect that would impact what we're doing now for our beneficiaries and service members.
Thank you.
Well, Leslie, let's stick with you since you're off mute. So as part of our Discover and Deliver series, the Chamber has been telling the story of life-changing biopharmaceutical innovation and how it's taking place in communities across the country. So I think you probably really have your finger on the pulse of many promising healthcare innovations that are being developed, right there in Washington. So could you provide us with a little peek inside the pipeline and maybe tell us about one or two of the innovations that you think have the potential to be truly game-changing treatments?
Yeah, I would be delighted. And of course, that's not an easy task to just narrow down to one or two. But I think if you look at our state and our region specifically, what you're seeing is a massive convergence of biotechnology and computing power supported by artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and machine learning that's allowing us to pursue a whole new generation of breakthroughs in medicine. And we're seeing example after example of that in our region. You probably remember when we first mapped the human genome in the late 1990s. Today, local pioneers right here in Washington are at the forefront of mapping the human adaptive immune system and the human proteome, the proteins that make up and control our cells. Adaptive Biotechnologies, which spun out of the Fred Hutch and is now one of our state's largest and fastest growing life science companies, is mapping the human adaptive immune system in its entirety. Adaptive is working with Microsoft to use artificial intelligence and cloud computing to sort through massive amounts of biological data to understand the human immune response to almost any disease. This information is then used to create a diagnostic blood test that can tell what diseases a person has or has had in the past. Adaptive has already developed a T-cell test for COVID, which can look back much further than any other test on the market and is actually able to distinguish between patients who have had the disease and therefore have an immune response and those who have been vaccinated for it. The company has also just introduced a new test for Lyme's disease and is busy developing tests for other difficult to diagnose diseases like celiacs and Crohn's versus ulcerative colitis and ovarian cancer. Even more exciting about Adaptive's technology is its potential to use information captured from an individual's own immune system to fight and cure their specific disease. That's always been the vision. If you look back to the people who envisioned sequencing the entire human genome and now the proteome and the immune system, has always been, how do we make what are truly, truly personalized individual treatments that match with our specific disease? So it's exciting to see this finally coming into fruition, although there's still quite a bit of work to do. Another area where this region is doing really incredible work is in proteomics and protein design. Proteins are the workhorses for most cellular activity, and their 3D structure, most specifically how they fold, is key. So unlocking how proteins fold would be a massive leap forward in our ability to understand disease and design new treatments and molecular interventions. Scientists across the globe have been pursuing this challenge for decades. So it's thrilling to hear that the David Baker Laboratory at UW's Institute for Protein Design appears to have cracked the code. The scientists in the Baker Lab are now able to use machine learning tools and predictive protein structures to actually design entirely new molecules, potential treatments from scratch. Dr. Baker's findings over the years have launched nearly a dozen very exciting biotech companies in our state, several of which have raised substantial amounts of investment capital and are growing fast. One of the latest projects underway in the Baker Lab, matching what we were just discussing, Dr. Colombo, is the development of a universal flu vaccine that could protect not only against all flus, but all coronaviruses as well. Another company just worth mentioning quickly, you may have been reading about, there was a big piece in the Seattle Times recently, is Nautilus Biotech. So while Adaptive is mapping the human adaptive immune system, Nautilus Biotechnology hopes to map the human proteome, all the proteins in a single drop of blood, for example. This is another Herculean task made possible by the convergence of AI and machine learning technologies with the data captured from a simple blood test. The company was founded by a tech entrepreneur, Sujal Patel. He founded and sold Isilon Storage, which was a big data company. And not unlike a number of tech entrepreneurs who really see the power of the technologies and the data that they're used to working with, and then have experienced or learned about the challenges we face in biology or in healthcare, they think, okay, I can bring that to the table. And I have a new way of thinking about how to solve a complicated problem. Our region is ripe with these technology companies, not to mention the incredible research institutions that we've been talking about. So the combination of their expertise is really placing us at the forefront nationally, if not globally, of convergence of big tech and
Oh, she might have froze just at the end there. Well, Major Cook, let me bring you back into the conversation and kind of ask a question in a similar vein. It was really interesting to hear about all of the work that you're doing in the convalescent plasma trials earlier in the conversation. And as you mentioned, the convalescent plasma has been used for nearly a century for any number of diseases, from hepatitis B to measles to even Ebola more recently. And as part of this Discover and Deliver campaign, one of the things that we've been highlighting is what the science can tackle next, which is why I loved hearing that answer from Leslie about all of the good work that's happening in Washington. So I'd love to hear from you about how convalescent plasma could be used to treat future medical challenges.
Sure. Thank you. So convalescent plasma is kind of, you can think of it in trauma as a tourniquet. In emerging infectious diseases, there's a period between the identification of the disease and the availability of targeted therapies or vaccines. And in this window is the benefit of convalescent plasma. As opposed to other things we discussed, the convalescent plasma program can be set up cheaply, quickly, and very low tech, especially using existing infrastructure. The requirements are basically having access to the donor pools of recovered patients, the ability to draw and process the plasma, and the ability to transfuse that plasma. And in most settings, to include combat zones, extremely rural areas, metropolitan cities, these resources are either readily available or easily established. So that's where convalescent plasma kind of still has its niche.
It's so interesting to hear. So maybe let's go back to Lieutenant Colonel Colombo. I know we were talking in the green room before the conversation about how a large focus of your work has been advancing virtual health, and you were suddenly the popular guy in school over the last 18 months. So I'd love to hear from you about some of your successes in this space and why improving telehealth is really critical to providing best-in-class healthcare for members of the military.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. It's kind of an interesting journey. I swore off research forever after I finished my master's before going to medical school, and the pandemic has clearly put an end to that, from kind of making it the focus of my job, whether it's partnering with my wife and that NIH to do the therapy trials, or leading and expanding virtual health at Madigan and doing research in how it can be relevant to austere environments, whether those are military, and then the opportunity to suddenly have resource limited environments here at home. If you had told, as a matter of fact, just to as a little bit of an aside, one of the funniest memories I have from the beginning of the pandemic, or the most ironic, is having been at the Society of Critical Care Medicine, teaching the inaugural fundamentals of critical care support for the austere environment, or resource limited environment. We had developed this course with some military and civilian co-authors with the intent that it would be a way for people to learn to do the first 24 hours of the care of the critically ill patient in an austere environment, whether that was on a medical mission trip or in a war or disaster torn country. And certainly the military relevance was obvious for all of the military co-authors and leaders on the course. And the reception that we had was good for the folks that attended the course, but it was far less well attended than we would have thought. And this was February of 2020 when I was in Orlando teaching this. And at the time, the comment was, are we really ever going to have an audience for this in the United States? And one of my co-authors, and actually the DoD lead on the ACT trial and EPIC, Captain retired now, Ryan Maves, he and I were, he was presenting a plenary talk about this infection that had happened in Wuhan, China. So that was really where the phase we were in February of this was an outbreak, and we had known that some cases were happening in Washington, but it certainly wasn't a pandemic. And at that time, everybody that was taking the course considered the resource limited setting to be somewhere else, not here. And obviously over the last 18 months, we've had the opportunity for Navy hospital ships to be, moored off of Manhattan. We've had hospitals running out of ventilators and oxygen, people having to use medications that weren't designed for what they originally designed for in order to care for patients, because that's all they had. And suddenly resource limitation became not just relevant for the military, where my original research in virtual health was helping Special Operations Command get clinical expertise to far forward medics when in situations where our infrastructure footprint is not as mature as a established theater of war when they're just small teams in large geographic settings, telemedicine and virtual health became relevant for having a surgeon talk a non-surgeon, a medic, through a procedure that they would otherwise not have the option to do. So when the pandemic hit and Madigan had to severely curtail elective surgeries and access to primary care, I went from doing research and interesting pilot projects in virtual health and trying to convince people to be early adopters, to being able to turn on access for primary care so people could get meds refilled, people could get simple healthcare issues seen that they otherwise couldn't physically come to the hospital for, either by policy or by fear of not wanting to leave the house for fear of community spread of COVID. So when I arrived at Madigan in 2018, we were on the order of 50 video visits a year as part of research and development. And I was proud of myself for getting that in the institution up to 200 by the time we reported at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And when the commander realized that we could still provide care for our beneficiaries through virtual access, that was ramped up very quickly to several thousand visits per week. And it's actually held on even as we've brought in-person care back. Many patients, not all, but many patients actually prefer this because for them it's far less hassle and access. They don't have to worry about parking. They don't have to worry about driving. They don't have to worry about sneaking the appointment into an otherwise busy day. It can just happen when they're available and their physician's available. And for a further extended research project was the National Emergency Telecritical Care Network. So this was my predecessor at Madigan, who's now the commander of the Telehealth and Telemedicine Research Consortium in the Army. He had the idea of, if we can use telemedicine in an ICU, why not be able to develop it on something that is a bit more available on ubiquitous hardware? It's become the norm that we all carry around pocket supercomputers for better or for worse. I mean, the computing power that I have in my pocket as I wander around on rounds is far better than what I grew up with home computers just being developed in the 1980s. And most of our patients have them as well. And most of our healthcare providers in hospitals without intensive care resources have them as well. So his vision was to assemble, interesting to be talking to the Chamber of Commerce and the small business innovators here on this call, because it was really a private public partnership and collaborative. I was able to assemble my research group at Madigan through the Geneva Foundation and some small business entrepreneurs that had developed a medical technology device that collected bedside medical device data and put it all together. Instead of having 6 separate monitors to look at, it would just all be collated on one monitor. And then another gentleman and his company who had developed an app-based software telemedicine platform. And I put them together with the perspective that we could bring for providing telemedicine in austere environments. And that was last April. It started out with 90 teams applying. Turned out to be 6 of us, or 9 of us at the beginning, then 6 of us through the first cut, and then 4 of us through the last cut. And we remain working on a telecritical care network to help practitioners and patients in hospitals that don't have an intensivist. And now with their referral centers all being overwhelmed and overcome by the pandemic, there's simply not the option to do what they usually do, which is transfer patients to a higher level of care. And what we found is that we have excellent generalists at rural and community hospitals. They just don't have the expertise and the experience and the training that an intensivist does. But with that consult, they're able to do excellent work and care for patients in place. And we've actually, we had some small successes in pilot projects in North Dakota and Minnesota, and some of our other colleagues in the Southeast. And one of the other teams actually supported a hospital in Puerto Rico early in the pilot and the pandemic. And then as the vaccine became in much better use, the rates went down. And as we were coming into the next phase of working on the telecritical care network, we thought we were going to have to do simulation exercises really to hone it and improve it and show its efficacy. Unfortunately, with this second peak that we've had at the end of the summer, we're now in 4 states and expanding that. And Washington State, it's kind of nice to be able to bring it home. The Washington Health Department was one of the first folks to answer our offer of, we can provide you a service that you don't have and you may need. And we're currently up and running in 4 community hospitals in Washington State, with 5 more that we're coordinating to start. And just in the last 2 weeks that we've turned it on, we've had 8 to 12 critically ill patients with repeat consults, managing ventilated COVID patients and COVID patients on non-invasive ventilation, and then even your routine critically ill patients that don't have COVID, septic shock patients that these hospitals just can't find a bed to send them to. And the choice would be, to not be able to provide the level of care that they could, but this telecritical care, using nothing more than the smartphone that everybody's carrying or a tablet, is able to provide them connection to that expertise and care for patients that otherwise couldn't be. So it's, it was difficult to get people to do telecritical care, I think, but not only is necessity the mother of invention, I think it might be the mother of adoption. So it's been quite a ride for the pandemic to be both involved in therapeutics research as well as have it affect my day job as the virtual health chief.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you say that. A lot of people actually prefer the telehealth visits now over going to a doctor's office. And I know for me personally, there's a couple things about pre-pandemic life I'll never go back to. And one is going to a grocery store and doing a big grocery order myself, and driving 45 minutes to Baltimore for a doctor's appointment. I would much rather use the telehealth option. So it's neat to see how that technology has been unleashed over the last 18 months. So Dr. Colombo, let's bring it back to you, and you can close this out here. So, Leslie spoke earlier in the program about the really vibrant innovation ecosystem working to advance medical research in Washington. And you mentioned earlier that you support the Uniformed Services University Infectious Disease Clinical Research Program at Madigan, quite a mouthful. And that's conducted in partnership with the academic community, industry, and the government. So I'd love for you to tell us a bit more about the program and how, this collaboration really helps advance cutting edge treatments for members of the military.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the USU IDCRP is actually founded in 2005 as an interagency agreement between the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease and the Uniformed Services University. And it also involves a collaborative agreement with the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for the Advancement of Military Medicine, which is actually a nonprofit organization that just supports the advancement of military medicine. And so the vision of the IDCRP is to substantially reduce the impact of infectious diseases on the military population through clinical research. And in order to do that, they have partnered with over actually 30 different partner sites internationally in a collaborative research network that is aimed at researching prevention and measures to control different infectious diseases that are of particular military relevance. So there are 6 research areas within the infectious disease clinical research program currently. One started out as the emerging infectious diseases research area, and that has now been adapted into the COVID-19 research area. And then there's also the acute respiratory infections research area, which the influenza study I mentioned earlier falls under that ARI research area. There's a sexually transmitted infections research area, an HIV research area, and then deployment and travel related infections and wound infections are the last 2. And so not every research area is represented at Madigan, although we have protocols from most of those, but they're at various places within our our program across the globe. We partner with various health agencies, including the CDC, FDA, obviously NIH, and various branches of the NIH. The Defense Health Agency Immunization Healthcare Division is one of our major partners on a variety of projects. And then just that the list goes on. And then we also work with multitude of academic partners, including individuals at the University of Washington, and then other institutions throughout the country, such as Johns Hopkins and Duke and so forth. And then other industry partners as related to whatever projects are coming up within the portfolio.
Wow, that's a tremendous amount of work and collaboration. So thank you for sharing that.
The network and the collaboration is really what allows the program to be flexible and adaptable and responsive, so that when something like COVID occurs, we can have a protocol up and running within a month for not only a treatment trial that we're partnering with NIH, but then also the longitudinal cohort study. We were able to adapt an emerging infectious diseases protocol that was on the shelf that had been designed more for Ebola, and imagining that what might emerge that then could be adapted for COVID and allow us to get started on learning more about this disease so that we could appropriately respond to it rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's funny, as part of this Discover and Deliver campaign, one of the things we talk a lot about is how working together we can achieve more. And I think, you know, this story you just told about all that great work really shows how that's happening in action right now. So to wrap up our program here today, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. You know, I think one of my takeaways from this conversation is that, you know, over the last 18 months, it's probably easy to see or to feel like we're always surrounded by doom and gloom. But, you know, based on our conversation today, I think there's a lot of reasons for hope. You know, it really sounds like we may be on the cusp of developing treatments for the next generation of health challenges, both for folks in the military and the civilian population more broadly. And it's because of that collaboration between industry, the military, the academic community, and great local government officials like Congresswoman Strickland. So quick plug here. So to shed a little more light on the treatments in development, our Chamber's Discover and Deliver campaign recently released a new interactive map, which illustrates where some innovative clinical trials are taking place, both in Washington and across the country. So I would encourage you guys to visit the website to learn more about the innovation that's taking place in your community, in addition to all of the great innovation that we've discussed here today. So just in closing, I'd love to thank the Congresswoman again for her service. My excellent panelists. It occurred to me in the middle of the conversation, I think I'm the only one that doesn't have a doctor in their title. So I was honored to moderate this conversation with you all. And then a big thank you to my colleagues, Frank, Charlie, and Scott for their assistance with this program, as well as the Association of Washington Business and the Tacoma-Pierce County Chamber for co-hosting this great program with us. So many thanks again for joining us today. And we look forward to working with all of you to continue to tell the story of the great innovation taking place in Washington State. Thank you again.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you for a great panel.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Kelly.
Thank you.